Okay. It's almost time. I think we should get started. All right. Good evening and welcome everyone to our November program, The Global Counterterrorism Fight since 2018. My name is Rose Dadaboy, and I'm the chair of the board of directors of the Richmond World Affairs Council. I would like to welcome all our guests, students, and World Affairs Council members. We are so pleased that you're able to join us this evening. Before I introduce our fantastic speaker to you, I would like to address a few housekeeping matters. If you're used to coming to our in-person events at the Jefferson Hotel, but are joining us for the first time online, welcome. We are grateful that technology makes it possible to still engage with you. As always, our program will start with the presentation. To ensure audio quality, all participants are muted during the presentation. After the presentation, we will have a Q&A session. And while we cannot see each other's faces, please know that we welcome your participation during the Q&A session as much as possible. Now, for that purpose, please use the Q&A box at the bottom bar of the screen and type your question there. You can actually type the question while the presentation is going on. You will not be disturbing our speaker. We will receive these questions in order, and when the presentation is done, Miriam will read one question at a time to our speaker. Alternatively, you can also use the raise hand icon, the option on our screen, and you can ask a question. At that point, we will unmute you so that you can personally ask a question to our speaker. I would also like to thank Data Concepts, Richmond's premier IT consulting firm, for their generous support, without which this webinar won't be possible. So a big thank you to Data Concepts. Now, today we are delighted to welcome Chris Costa. Mr. Costa recently joined the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C. as the executive director. He's also a former special assistant to the president and senior director for counterterrorism on the National Security Council. There, he was responsible for coordinating counterterrorism policy and strategy, as well as US hostage recovery activities. Mr. Costa has 34 years of national security experience and success in strategy, policy, special operations, counterintelligence, and human intelligence, deploying on multiple contingencies and to combat operations in the Panama, in Afghanistan, and Iraq. He served with the United States Special Ops Command as program director. And before that, as a Department of the Navy civilian at the Naval Special Warfare Development Group with US Navy SEALs. As a senior instructor, Mr. Costa also taught on topics related to national security, strategy, and counterterrorism at Norwich University's Strategic Studies and Defense Analysis program. He holds a master's degree in strategic intelligence from the American Military University, another master's degree in national security and strategic studies from the U.S. Naval War College. His military awards and decorations include the Defense Superior Service Medal, the Legion of Merit, and 2 Bronze Stars. In May 2013, Mr. Costa was inducted into the United States Special Operations Command Hall of Honor for extraordinary and enduring service to Special Operations Forces. We are so privileged to have Mr. Costa here with us tonight. And without further ado, I request him to take on this mantle. Thank you.
Hey, thank you for the great introduction, Rose. I think I sent you my long biography. I apologize for that. I just realized. In any event, thank you for the warm welcome, and thank you very much to Richmond World Affairs Council. Thank you to all those folks who have joined virtually. I really do appreciate the opportunity to talk about not just foreign affairs, but specifically counterterrorism, my experiences at the National Security Council, because those experiences are important to convey to the citizens we serve. I've got to do something I haven't done for a long time. I have to tell you that these views expressed in the talk are mine and do not reflect the official policy or position of the United States government. I tell you that because I recently was sworn back into the United States government to provide senior consulting to different departments and agencies. So it's a privilege to be back in government service, but I have to be careful. All of that said, really, I want to be brutally honest to the extent that I can and answer all of your questions after I frame a little bit kind of where we were from a counterterrorism standpoint and where we are today. Realize that this is a sober topic. It's hard to be really upbeat, but it's important to convey the national security work. And I do so with all humility, having worked with the entire intelligence community for so many years. So if I use the personal pronoun, it's by accident, because it was a collective team. All of that said, the introduction really underscores that I've been around for a long time, over 34 years, serving the nation, and that took me to the International Spy Museum. I bridge 2 worlds. I want to frame the problems like this. So a mental image for you. The Cold War, I fought in the final days of the Cold War, arguably small f, right? We all contributed to, bringing down the Soviet bear, so to speak, in quotes. The world was really considered 2 sumo wrestlers, right? It was a bipolar world. It was the Soviet Union, it was the United States. Life was a lot simpler then. The wall came down, we fought the first Gulf War, and then the image that should pop in your head is, a kid's soccer team, because that's what globalism brought. We were trying to reconcile all of that while I was an Army officer. During this period, I had an opportunity to deploy in different gray zones in the world, places that weren't combat, weren't peace, places like Bosnia. Those experiences, and from what you heard in my biography, I will tell you all of that really came to bear when I walked into the White House, literally on Inauguration Day, to serve the President of the United States. Now, for anybody that is extremely partisan, I want to frame also all of that experience described in my bio, that was serving the government as a nonpartisan. I was detailed from Special Operations Command. So one day I was a mid to senior civilian at the headquarters. The next day I was in a protocol position working for the president as one of his staff officers at a 3-star position. That's something that really your cumulative experiences really come to bear. And I didn't fully appreciate that until I left the White House, how valuable all of those experiences were. So special operations to the White House, my greatest competitive advantage besides all of the leadership along the way, because I want to stress, because I understand there are likely some students here, some future superstars in the intelligence community, no doubt joining in. And there are certainly veterans that will appreciate the one competitive advantage I had because of those experiences was learning from non-commissioned officers, leading troops in combat, in peacetime, and being an intelligence officer, which meant I had a full appreciation for the importance of being well-informed, how to ask the right questions, and the expectation. Since I spent my career collecting intelligence as a human intelligence officer for special operations, I knew the questions to ask. I understood our capabilities. So that was a big advantage. Let me just set the scene a little bit more. So 2016, an election takes place. The President of the United States, 4 years this month, I remember it well, I joined the presidential transition team. Didn't know how any of that would go. Special Operations Command couldn't even figure out how I'd do that. And I just did it. I took one of those career risks and I figured it out myself. We came to DC. I joined the presidential transition team in a post-Bin Laden world. So I understood the strategic landscape, and that landscape was disrupted. I want to remind you that we had arguably precipitously pulled forces out of Iraq. In time, that turmoil at the tail end of the Obama administration, or at the latter part of the Obama administration, again, I'm not making a political judgment here, but in my professional judgment, it was a precipitous withdrawal. Troops left Iraq lock, stock, and barrel. And frankly, our Iraqi counterparts, despite the fact that we spent years training them, they were not prepared to deal with what came, which was the emergence of ISIS for a lot of reasons maybe we can talk about in question and answer. So ISIS comes in and we have a disrupted landscape from Africa to the Philippines. That's what I was facing as I came into the White House. We understood that we had problems with, the term of art now is radical Islamist terrorists, which is actually a good term of art. Those attacks had taken place throughout Europe, a spate of attacks, 2015, 2016. Some of those things are still haunting us in light of what just happened in France. Maybe we can talk about that, or in Vienna. All of that said, the ultimate metaphor I want to frame before we dive in a little deeper, I want you to know that I had an opportunity to travel only a couple times while I was in the White House. I flew with a Homeland Security advisor and a small team. We went to Israel. I went to the Golan Heights in Israel, looking over the Golan Heights into Syria. I could actually see some mortar fire, some smoke from some firefights. The Israelis showed us where there were some ISIS operators, where some Hezbollah fighters were in support of Iran fighting ISIS, but truly wanted to counter American operations on the ground in Syria. But that said, they were aligned with us to defeat ISIS indirectly. We had Russians, we had Turks, we had Syrian Democratic Forces, we had the forces of Assad and a civil war, and all of this playing out in a US fight to defeat ISIS on the ground. That's what we faced. This is a gray zone environment. All of that played out. And as I looked into Syria, I realized that's the metaphor for what we were dealing with. So on day one, it was Inauguration Day. I heard the cheers. We went into the Situation Room. You've heard about the Situation Room. It's true. It was established in John F. Kennedy's time at the White House to make sure we had a secure place for national security decision-making. When I heard the cheers, the Secret Service moved us into the Situation Room, the cheers from the inauguration, went in, established our positions, and I began to ensure that we had coordinated all of our security for inauguration and across the country, and that we were watching threat streams globally. Now, there was a bit of a leap of trust here because I inherited a professional team, but I didn't get to spend a lot of time with that team. You're seeing what's happening in a transition now, or a lack thereof. There was a very, I don't want to use the word chaotic. A lot of people talk about chaos. It was certainly uncertain. And We stood up a transition team. It was quick. There was a lot of uncertainty, a lot of inexperience with the Trump transition team. So I did what I needed to do, which was ensure that my team was prepared and there was a level of trust there. Got into the situation room, and I was assured that the situation really across the globe was reasonably normal, all things considered. But I want you to also know that I faced 4 problems on day one. And I like to stress this whenever I talk about counterterrorism. We faced a decision on the necessity to conduct a raid against Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, an Al-Qaeda affiliate in Yemen. We faced that. Secondly, a persistent, significant, and deadly threat, potentially, to commercial aviation. We don't talk a lot about that, but there was a laptop ban, and I will tell you, and I'd like to convey that the professionalism of the team looking at mitigation measures across the world to ensure that we didn't have a disaster weighed heavy on us on day one. Thirdly, I recognized day one, week one, we're going to focus on accelerating our defeat ISIS strategy. Now, I want you also to know that since I was clearly a career professional, I was detailed, not a political appointee. My objective was to ensure that we had continuity between the administrations. That might surprise some people listening to this discussion, but counterterrorism is generally and should not be politicized, right? It is the one almost pure discipline that you're allowed to focus on the art of counterterrorism and applying the tools. I had a team, didn't care what administration they served in, they came from the interagency, and we focused on those 3 problems and a 4th one, and that was hostages. We had hostages from Africa to the Middle East to Afghanistan. So my role was twofold. I was responsible for being the convening authority for what we call the Counterterrorism Security Group. Let me just step back for a second to demystify national security decision-making, really. It's not as complex as it might seem to people listening. In fact, at the end of the day, what it's really about is being well-informed by intelligence and producing options for the president. And that means convening meetings with the interagency. At my level, it was the lowest senior group of individuals that met to work on counterterrorism problems. From the interagency, FBI, CIA, NSA, we pulled together a meeting at the assistant secretary at the 3-star general level, pulled together to work on options that our team helped prepare for us. That went from there to deputy meetings, and then ultimately to principals and to the president. Principals meaning cabinet officials, depending on how the meeting was called. Without getting into a lot of the nuance, the bottom line was I was the convening authority with my team for counterterrorism policy issues and crises, as well as hostages. I also was the convening authority for hostage recoveries, and I'd like to talk a little bit about that as well. We covered down on maybe 7 bins within the NSC, everything from protecting our embassies overseas and ensuring that we understood a threat picture, that we always understood the threat to the homeland, that we amped up our fight against ISIS, meaning we wanted to defeat ISIS and understand how the organization morphed. Thirdly, we wanted to focus on Al-Qaeda, Hezbollah, and other affiliates of Al-Qaeda. And then 4 functional areas: get terrorists off the internet, focus on foreign fighters, focus on a significant problem. What do you do with the detainees that are captured on the battlefield in Syria? And I already identified how complex Syria was with all the actors on the ground. And we had a weekly threats video teleconference. If you've ever seen the show 24, just know that the real 24, in my estimation, at least in DC, in the Beltway, when you're not close to the battlefield, was really in our offices, where we convene at least once a week, a meeting on the threat streams across the planet. Not just to understand the threat streams, but me with the bully pulpit of the White House, of the president, being able to direct the interagency to take mitigation measures. It was tense. It was very impressive to see the interagency come together. And I can't underscore enough that we had learned painful lessons as a result of 9/11. And the counterterrorism enterprise in the United States government is really eye-watering. And we can't do that without our foreign partners. I talk about commercial aviation threats, or the threat to commercial aviation, airliners. We couldn't have worked those problems without working with our foreign partners. So in a nutshell, that is kind of the stone soup of strategy and decision making. My predecessor told me I had the most important job in Washington, D.C. And I really thought that was a little hyperbolic. And after I sat through some of our video teleconferences, the people I worked with in our team, and arguably my position was a significantly important job. And you don't know any of those people that worked on my team. They did their job 7 days a week, 18 hours a day, and sometimes slept at their desks for me and for the nation. A couple quick points and I want to move on. I will just tell you my bottom line lessons learned is the by, with, and through model works, meaning working with foreign partners, working with small special operations footprints overseas. We didn't believe that we should have large military footprints. We didn't believe we wanted endless wars, and special operations really serves that purpose. We could talk more about that in question and answers, because I don't think we want to decrement all of our deployed forces overseas. We don't want large scale presence in places, but we certainly need to work with foreign partners, because the key theme is CT, counterterrorism pressure works. When I say CT pressure, I'm talking about kinetic action overseas. And I want you to know that I came into the White House and I wanted to work on what I would call New Testament counterterrorism solutions, work on terrorist rehabilitation programs, countering violent extremists, work on prison programs from a policy standpoint. We did not have the luxury in the first days, weeks, year of the Trump administration because of the threat worldwide. A couple points I want you to think about, and maybe we can dive deeper in questions and answers. I often get answered which terrorist groups pose the most significant threats and what it keeps you up at night. A rebranded ISIS, a reconstituted Al-Qaeda. I'm watching closely what's happening with Al-Qaeda in Syria, for example, in Afghanistan. Just a year ago, I spoke, and again, all my sources are open source. I read what you read and talk to a lot of people. I thought perhaps there were 100 or so hardcore Al-Qaeda fighters in Afghanistan. I believe that's an that's underestimated. I believe that it's in excess of maybe 400 or 500, but it's embedded in the communities, in the tribal structure now in Afghanistan. So I worry about a resurrected Al-Qaeda. I worry about a resuscitated Hezbollah, though that's a good news story. I want to make sure we talk about some good news, right? And I always worry about lone wolf actors, and we can talk about that. I do want to share, just because I have an opportunity, and again, there might be some future leaders in the audience. I want you to know that I never lost track of the idea that I was going to the most recognized address on the planet. And I didn't squander that opportunity, which meant I had to lead. And I spent a lot of time ensuring I protected my team from any politicization, because everybody, candidly, and I'm saying this a little bit tongue in cheek, everybody thinks they're an expert on terrorism. It's kind of sexy for some people, even at the National Security Council, because we were truly taking it to our adversaries overseas. All of that said, I really needed to protect my team so they could do their work, so we could churn out the best recommendations for the President of the United States. You do that by providing clarity, by trying to stay unflappable, protecting your team, and reinforce what you promise to your team with actions. And be prepared to tell truth to power. And candidly, I knew what my red lines were for leaving, and I never came close to those lines. There were some tough days. There were some days I didn't know if I was going to keep my job. I did manage to get through a year, and that was my detail at the White House. So just, I want to touch on a few things we can talk about. Not too far from Richmond is Charlottesville. I was in the White House during Charlottesville. I briefed the president on the aftermath of Charlottesville. We can talk about that. That's a problem. It bothers me significantly. Sort of a trend of white supremacist violence. We can talk more about that. We built into the counterterrorism strategy. Whatever you hear, know that our 2018 counterterrorism strategy, anyone who studies this stuff will make the point, no matter what side you are on the political spectrum, that the framing of the threat from the team that I worked with probably put together the most thoughtful, cogent counterterrorism strategy in the history of our country. Now, that's not saying a lot in terms of counterterrorism strategies, because we really didn't have a cogent strategy on counterterrorism until after 9/11. But we built in verbiage, framing to go after white supremacists that are violent and are terrorists, to include even neo-Nazis. The fact that we built that into the strategy was a surprise to some. But that takes us full circle to the discussion of Charlottesville, and we can come back to that. So I'm guilty as charged of focusing probably too much on counterterrorism pressure, which meant direct action overseas. We also worked on policy that I can't talk about, which I'm very pleased with. We debureaucratized the way the government moves and department and agencies act overseas to go after our adversaries. That's about as much as I could say about that. From a hostage standpoint, I do want to share that we enjoyed some success. We had many hostages. I am prohibited from saying how many, but somewhere between 20 and 35 that we were focused. Some you know, some you've never heard of, deliberately, but we focus night and day on trying to recover those hostages. In this nation, in the last 4 years, this is not a campaign ad, it did tremendous work. And that's the interagency, that's the Department of Defense, FBI, CIA, National Security Agency. We pulled together as a nation with excellent continuity in the previous administration to the present day, working on hostages. And if you ask me some questions about that, I can elaborate on hostages that were recovered in Yemen recently. I can elaborate on the hostage rescue operation that took place 2 weeks ago that may have gotten lost in the news cycle because of the election. All elements of power are focused on bringing home hostages. And I can say a lot of hard work took place, and we were able to bring Caitlin Coleman and her children home from captivity, held by a terrorist, the Haqqani network, with great risk. They were recovered, and they're doing very well. You might know the story. Caitlin was held in captivity for 5 years with her children. We brought some Benghazi conspirators to justice. Another story that was really lost in the news cycle of a week, but I think it represents the importance of policy driving operations overseas. What am I talking about? There was a Benghazi conspirator that was complicit in the raid, for the lack of a better term, the ransacking of our embassy in Benghazi. His name is Mustafa al-Imam. We recognized that we had actionable intelligence. We in the NSC, folks in my office, we drove the policy, came together as a team, got a decision made to actually conduct an operation overseas where Mustafa al-Imam, sorry, it's a long day, was rolled up. and brought back to the United States to face trial here in DC, and he'll serve 22 years in prison. I think that's a good news story. That's, again, pardon the expression, but that's the New Testament covenant of counterterrorism. That's my metaphor, right? Where we brought justice, not, Old Testament justice, again, excuse the metaphor, but New Testament justice, meaning we brought him back from where he was sleeping back to the United States to face justice and go to trial or go to prison. And that's where he'll stay for the next 20 years. That was driven by policy. All of that said, what kept me awake at night was the possibility of a lone wolf attack. On October 31st, Halloween, an individual by the name of Saipov, a naturalized US citizen, on Halloween, wanted to run down moms and dads on a bicycle path. He managed to kill 8 people and wound 11 others. Self-radicalized, true lone wolf, angry, radicalized, committed a heinous crime. I will tell you, I was significantly disappointed. Our team was zeroed in on looking for any connections overseas, direct connections. Was he being controlled or directed by ISIS? Pardon me, he was inspired. He was not directed. It underscores how difficult counterterrorism is. So I could go on and on. I just want to kind of offer some final thoughts, and then we can open it up to questions. The counterterrorism strategy in 2018, as I said, that was a group effort of the entire interagency, really to frame how we were going to get at the terrorist problem. Since inauguration, we're in an interesting point where all of you have observed kind of the growth, the development. How have we done? It's up to you, the American public, really to grade how the interagency's done, how the world community has done working on counterterrorism. But I will tell you, I am particularly proud of the entire community. And as I said, there was excellent continuity between the previous administration. Those teammates and I stayed in touch. There was no partisan counterterrorism issues. We still talk. Many of them might be back in the Biden administration, the folks that worked previous to me. So there's a significant evolution of thought, and there's a continuity. I already underscored the absolute critical notion of the interagency and also our foreign partners. I will tell you, when I mentioned Charlottesville, the idea of racially motivated domestic terrorism, that was built into the strategy. And I recognized, and my team recognized, that this is going to be a significant problem. Why? Because the nation is polarized. So individuals that are animated by ISIS propaganda, you've seen the movie, you've seen how individuals go to the internet, they're animated by social media, chat rooms. That happens with jihadists, but it also happens with individuals that are on the far right extremists. That's the worrisome trend. So we're not just dealing with jihadists. Now we're worried very much about racially motivated domestic terrorists, as well as militia movements. It's not against the law to be a militia movement member, right? But it's against the law to conspire to kill a governor, to plan an attack at a hospital because you're angry about COVID and you're anti-US government. Those are the things that keep me up at night. All right. Final thoughts. So if you prompt me with the right question, I could probably offer a light story or two that underscores and is actually humorous on how intense it is to work at the National Security Council and how sometimes we forgot our sense of humor and then we were jerked back to reality that we're all human beings and under intense pressure, nothing like humor works to kind of be an ointment for all the bruising you get sometimes at the NSC. So just to close out, I want you to know that this nation has a sound counterterrorism enterprise. I'm proud of everybody that I work with. And I don't want to sound like a recruiting poster. It would be very easy for me to take out an alternative viewpoint. And I have no problem with telling truth to an American audience, a group of citizens, how we're doing. And my report card is relatively high for what our community continues to do. So I guess I will stop there at about 30 minutes, and hopefully somebody has a question or wants to take issue with something I said. I'm prepared to handle all that.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Costa. And we are happy to take questions now. And I see that we already have a few. And I will give you the first one. So James Cottrell would like to know, we have heard about some of the issues in the Philippines. How do you evaluate these as well as risks elsewhere in Asia?
Let me make sure I heard the question. Philippines, right?
Yes, correct.
Excellent question. Thank you very much. So I told you about our day one problems. Our day one, week one, in fact, the first 4 weeks, I wasn't expecting problems in the Philippines. Of all the places, that was the part of the world that we weren't particularly focused on. My friends from other countries that operate in the region similarly were surprised. So in short, we were surprised with ISIS and a foothold in some places in Philippines. I mean, hardcore ISIS operators and rising. So we were taken by surprise. Of course, it wasn't an epic strategic surprise, but it put us on our heels. We worked very closely with partners, our Australian, New Zealand counterparts, but also partners in Malaysia, in other places in the region. And I will tell you, there's a good news story, not that terrorism ever is a good news, but one of the reasons why terrorists found a foothold in Philippines is there's lots of terrain. There's jungle. It's an archipelago, if I said the word right. It's very littoral, so it's on the water, but there's inlet waterways, lots of places to hide. Philippine armies, the Marines, they have their hands full. Police, interior. But at the end of the day, one of the reasons they went to the Philippines is because other countries focused on policies like not closing their borders, but doing a better job with biometrics. So foreign fighters didn't leave the battlefields in Syria and then go to another jihad in Malaysia. So they found their way to the Philippines. So we recognized that that was going to be a problem, meaning pressure in Syria, foreign fighters were going to find their way to other fields of jihad. And one of those fields was Philippines. We were taken by surprise, but in time, I think the Philippine government got a handle on it, but it's a long-term problem there. It's not going to be one overnight.
Thank you, thank you. I see Phil Walker has a question, and I will unmute you, Phil, and please hold your question.
Thank you very much. First and foremost, I'd like to say thank you very much for the opportunity to be in this meeting and learn tonight. I very much appreciate it. But sir, if you don't mind, I have two quick questions for you. One, you had mentioned kinetic operations overseas and their effectiveness. When looking at SOCOM assets or OGA assets, and the current and forthcoming cyber threats, how do you manage the difference in the utility of both of those things in terms of counterterrorism, sir?
Yeah, so great question. I'll hopefully do a better job answering your first part of the question on kinetic action. This gets to the heart of, again, our focus that first year, Old Testament counterterrorism, which is a euphemism, as I said, for direct action overseas. As unpleasant as it is, putting pressure on our adversaries, keeping them moving. When leaders meet to plan, plot, bringing down airliners, we have advanced intelligence in some cases, we're able to take kinetic action. But that is really it's an over-reliance on heavy-handed, military power, right? At the end of the day, in a perfect world, in where we want to get to is where these problems are more localized, where the United States only operates that way in extremis. But just one example, then I'll go to the latter part of your question. One example is Somalia. We have according to the media, about 700 troops on the ground. But the Kenyan government recently, again, according to the papers, went to the United States and said, we're going to need some help. We want you to be able to overfly and strike terrorists in Kenya because they use our space, cross over from Somalia into Kenya, where they presume that the United States doesn't have authorities to use drones, as an example. All of that said, there's going to be a demand signal for other countries to ask for help, to put pressure, and to continue doing that. But as I said, the objective is to make terrorism problems more localized, where it can be handled by the Kenyans without kinetic pressure from the United States. But that's still going to take some time. On cyber, we did very little work in my office on ISIS taking advantage of, just one example, of working in cyberspace. But we recognize that our adversaries are learning adversaries. ISIS, I talked to an ISIS defector and he was brought in the fold. ISIS wanted him just because he understood technology and American commercial aviation. So obviously you can guess what they might have been interested in. All of that said, we worry about a generation of ISIS, future terrorists, being able to operate in cyberspace. Imagine an attack of a restaurant in the United States, a complex attack of IEDs, knifings, and at the same time, some kind of cyber disruption. So if you can think it, it can happen. We didn't war game through a lot of that because, again, the first year I'm framing the work we focused on, we didn't see that as a significant threat. But the idea of disinformation and the work that's being done by Cyber Command, it's not unrelated to counterterrorism because disinformation is being used to stoke racial hatreds, hence to move people on the spectrum, white supremacists, move them to violence. So when Cyber Command, as reported, goes after Iran, for example, because they're using the Proud Boys, right? You read about this, right? Sending emails to people in Pennsylvania that's really coming from Iran. It wasn't the Proud Boys trying to stir the pot, Proud Boys being a far-right group, if I'm characterizing it right. But understand that the practitioners in the future are going to have to focus on cyber as well as kinetic action. So maybe I addressed your question. Maybe I didn't do it fully, but that's how I'd answer it.
No, sir, that was perfect. Thank you very much. If you don't mind, I have one more quick question.
Sure.
So just a little bit about myself. I recently just got out of the military after serving for 5 years, and I'm a Homeland Security major. You spoke about your colleagues very much having a 7 days a week job is what you phrased it as. Looking at someone that wants to continue to serve their country and make a difference, but I want to be able to afford having a family. Is there any particular direction that you could kind of point me?
So that's an awesome question. Thank you very much for your service. Now, I want to underscore what I said about leadership. This was the end of my career. It was the pinnacle of all of that hard work. It was just my wife and I here in DC living in a tiny, tiny apartment at the time. I was at the twilight of my career, arguably, and this was it for me. So I made it clear to my team that I was going to work 7 days. And there's a little hyperbole there with the rest of my team because I didn't expect them to be there on Saturdays and Sundays. And remember, I made the point that I told my team what I told my team by communicating clarity included how they take care of their families. Not everybody that says take care of your family really means it when the chips are down. And there are priorities, right? National security. But at the end of the day, most leaders tell their team to take care of your families. I want you to go to that, recital for your daughter, or go to that ball game for your son. Somebody else will cover down. We went to great pains to make sure that we took care of each other. That's the only way we survived as a team. And candidly, and I hope I don't offend anyone, you're allowed to have alcohol in the Eisenhower office building complex. And on a Friday night, on a Saturday after working all day, you could have a beer or you could have a Coca-Cola and you could laugh about the week. So all of the ideas of leading in an organization, you can find balance, because my teammates were able to do that. You can't work at a place like NSC long. That's why we only keep people there a year or two. It is very difficult. But my advice to you would be always maintain a fitness regime. Have a partner where you have somebody that you can talk to. In my case, I had my wife taking care of everything, sometimes physically moving me to bed and taking the book off my chest when I fall asleep. It was so challenging on some days. It was really hard. I walked back and forth to work. I was very lucky, but it was hard to even get out of the office and physically walk home. But I found the balance, and we somehow survived all of that. So if I can do that, you can do that. I had one spouse, still married after 35 or so years. How many years? 35 years, and two kids and a grandson, and they're doing great. So you can do it if I did it. Balance, physical fitness, and practice what you preach, and be steady.
Thank you very much, sir. I very much appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Costa. I was curious about what is your opinion on the rivalry between the Taliban and ISIS in Afghanistan? And you probably heard most recently about the attacks at the Kabul University. Taliban claimed they did not do it. What's your take on this? What's your opinion on this? And also, what's your opinion on the talks between the US and Taliban and the government of Afghanistan?
Well, that's a loaded question. So what I think about ISIS and Taliban fighting each other, as a former special operations officer, as an intelligence officer, that makes my heart beat a little faster, because they're really attriting each other, right? And that's not a bad thing, because ISIS, again, wants to establish a caliphate. ISIS would like to bring down airliners. Now, the idea of Taliban, ISIS fighting each other is, again, is helpful. My concern, though, and this ties to the second part of your question, first of all, I want to say that I want peace and reconciliation in Afghanistan, but I am very, very wary that it may be elusive to get to where we think we can go by withdrawing troops out of Afghanistan just because we want to end endless wars. We all want to end endless wars. We have to find a balance between a really small footprint of special operations and support to the Afghanistan government, or we're going to go right back full cycle to where we were prior to 9/11, meaning there's going to be sanctuaries available for ISIS to train and plan. Pardon me. That said, I am also very much concerned with down and outers. Let's just say that their peace and reconciliation breaks out. How does the Taliban share governance with the current government? How does that work out? Well, that's up to the Afghans to figure out. It's their nation. But at the same time, there are going to be some disenfranchised Taliban that are going to say, I'm going to go join ranks with the more pure jihadists, with ISIS. So I am very, very concerned that if we're not careful, we're going to end up in the same kind of situation we were in the 1980s. And ultimately, there's going to be a sanctuary, and we're going to be concerned about again, terrorists planning future attacks against the United States. There is a school of thought, and I don't subscribe to it, where some say enough. If we don't have a 9/11, if we can prevent a 9/11, then everything else is just acceptable risk. And we just need to flat out withdraw out of Afghanistan. If you want to know kind of where I sit on that, General McMaster just wrote a book called Battlegrounds. It's a great analysis of the world. We weren't always on the same page on counterterrorism, candidly, but I really respect where he's fallen out on Afghanistan. There are probably over a dozen terrorist organizations that operate in that space. So it is a complex problem. I will say that the Afghans were tremendous partners with the United States. I worked with human intelligence sources, Afghans, that saved American lives. So I am very grateful, I always will be, to the Afghans that were so loyal and supportive to me in my mission. But it's a tough problem. I worry a lot about it. There's another hostage that's on the border somewhere, I'm sure, either in Pakistan or in Afghanistan, or as I said, in the border area. His name's Frericks. I want him brought home. I want us to factor in him. I think the United States is committed to bringing him home.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Costa. Appreciate that.
Thomas Lubick has a question, and I'll read it. How does the recognition of Israel by several Arab states change the security situation in the Middle East? Does it affect ISIS and Al-Qaeda's strategy, a resurgence of Palestinian terrorism?
So that's a tremendous question. And I am very optimistic. Let me go back to, I served a year in the administration. I was cautiously optimistic with how we were building a bloc, a BLOC, right? A bloc to counter malign Iranian influence. We didn't talk a lot about that. They are a problem in the region. They'll continue to pose a threat to Israel and to the region. I talked about Hezbollah, proxies. You talk about the Quds Force. You know what happened to Soleimani from the Quds Force. I happen to believe that was a fair and good strike. All of that said, I am very optimistic that although the Saudis, I was so optimistic about the Saudis, then as a result of Khashoggi, we took huge strides backwards as a result of Saudi Arabia making bad decisions. Flash forward a couple years later, the idea that the administration has brokered a deal with the Emirates, Bahrain, and I forget who else in the region, I should know, but it's late. But I am very optimistic. In a way, and I've been to the Palestinian Authority. I met with Abu Abbas, with the Homeland Security Advisor, while I was serving in the administration. And our message was, hey, thank you for your cooperation. You continue to do great work on a counterterrorism front, but you've got to change some of your behavior. Trying to get money to suicide bombers' families isn't helpful. Terrorism is wrong, period. So I'm hoping that Palestinian terrorism will abate, will in time, the change as a result of this new, groundbreaking alliance breaking out in the region, that will be the forcing action for the Palestinians to change some of their behaviors and be less intransigent. I really am sympathetic for their position on one level, but I'm looking at it very objectively, and they dug their heels in. Now, Israel certainly has pushed on settlement issues. I also was in the region when there was a significant amount of tensions as a result of an incident with an Israeli in Jordan. Long story short, the United States has been committed to defusing tensions. And I suspect that the next administration will have a different relationship with Israel. But I think what we're seeing now, to answer the question directly, is really, really a positive change for the region. And I'm very cautious and optimistic about the future as a result of this.
Thank you. John Barry asks, does the threat of extreme left-wing domestic terrorism cause you as much sleeplessness as the threat of extreme right-wing domestic terrorism?
So in many quarters, that's a loaded question, right? But the bottom line is there are no left-wing, for lack of a better term of art, we should call them racially or ethnically motivated extremists. That's the new term of art. And that means Antifa, violent actors with Antifa, and violent actors on the far right. The reason we're old school people like me, we call it left and right. It's wrong to do that because it does make this look very political, right? And at the end of the day, the US government is looking for violent actors that are mobilizing for violence, whether they're on the far left or the far right, racially or ethnically motivated violent extremism. So that means the FBI will investigate anyone that's organizing for violence. So from a threat standpoint, based on what I'm seeing, based on remarks from Director of the FBI, Wray, based on what I know from people I talk to, the threat is more pervasive on, again, lack of a better term, on the far right. Extremists on that side of the spectrum. They're better organized, whereas, again, Antifa is not an organization. It's not Antifa domestic violent actors. It's Antifa loosely organized, but they're not structured like a terrorist group. That's not their objective. In many ways, as I understand it, they form almost a self-defense. That doesn't mean they don't violate federal law, that they don't violate law. That doesn't mean that they don't do things that are repugnant to any of our citizens. But at the end of the day, right now, I am more worried about racially and ethnically motivated terrorists on the far right, because that's where the intense anger is. It's called accelerationism. They're accelerationists, which means they feel ideologically that their world is under attack. I'm talking about violent white supremacists. And there were some violent white supremacists that were among those groups in Charlottesville. And there were violent actors on the left as well. But at the end of the day, the significant threat at Charlottesville was from the far right.
Thank you. That was pretty clear. I skipped a question, so I'll go back to the top here. How much do other countries like our European allies help in counterterrorism? Do joint operations sometimes take place?
Yeah, so that's a terrific question. So as I tried to reinforce in the presentation, we couldn't do our work without foreign partners. That threat to commercial aviation, we were lockstep with our foreign intelligence partners. The idea of intelligence sharing, working with non-traditional partners, that continues to be an important imperative. It's embedded in our 2018 strategy. It's really a maxim. We can't do counterterrorism. It is, in effect, the coin of the realm, really. I could spend all day talking about our foreign partners that I've worked with in Iraq, in Afghanistan, my German friends, the federal police. We cannot execute sound counterterrorism policy without being in sync with our foreign partners, nor can we conduct operations overseas. And in the future, we're going to have to go back to relying more on those traditional partnerships, working out of embassies with our foreign partners, because again, we're not going to necessarily have big foreign military footprints, rather, overseas. So it's crucial. I mean, and every time I think of foreign partners, it makes me smile because they're so committed to working with the United States.
That's encouraging. Thank you. And one more. You mentioned counterterrorism should not be politicized, and I completely agree. So from a nonpartisan perspective, how do you think the current administration's refusal to give the president-elect access to daily intelligence briefings will impact their preparedness going into the presidency, if at all?
So my answer is pretty straightforward on that. And I talked to a news station about that this afternoon. I was interviewed. The bottom line is, remember I shared the 4 or 5 day one problems I had. Multiply that by some number significantly greater. The president has a lot on his plate. The president-elect needs to have access to the intelligence. He needs to be thinking about day one, not on day one, in advance of it. So he needs to be informed by our intelligence community. He needs access to the presidential daily brief. That's not enshrined in law. That's enshrined in tradition going back to the 1960s. And what's the cost, right? Even if you take the view that President Biden or President-elect Biden will never be the president of the United States. It's going to go through the court system. Even if you take that view, as unlikely as it is, the bottom line is, what is the damage to hedge your bets and ensure a potential leader of the United States is forearmed with the intelligence that makes him a better decision maker, not on day one, but prior. He needs to have access to that intelligence. And everybody knows that. And anybody up on Capitol Hill or anywhere else that denies that, really, they're the ones that are politicizing this issue, right? Not the practitioners. Everybody in the intelligence community knows that and are prepared to deliver the intelligence. But at the end of the day, again, that's a decision that is made at a very different level. So the analytical teams are prepared to deliver. The collectors are still risking their lives collecting that intelligence. We forget about that. And those collectors and analysts are prepared to deliver. It's just a matter of some bureaucratic decisions being made to do so.
I guess we have time for one last question. Miriam?
Yes, Mark Dre, you've been very patient for a while. Let me unmute you.
Okay, I think I'm unmuted.
Yes.
So you've been very generous in thanking lots of people. I think we want to thank you and wish you the best as you take over the leadership role at the museum. I was interested in your comments generally that says you need to focus on terrorism locally. And you made several comments regarding white supremacy in Charlottesville and so forth. I wanted to just circle back a little bit about the recent unpleasantness we've gone through based on some unfortunate incidents. But the Black Lives Movement, some of the leadership's comments seem to involve some of the bad actors that you mentioned too on the left side and seem problematic to lots of people in the context of domestic terrorism. The influence of super PACs and in the context though, in my question specifically has to do with the concept of defunding police, keeping it out of politics, which may be impossible, but how does the efforts to potentially defund law enforcement impact the efforts of our domestic counterterrorism group?
No, I very much appreciate the question. Here's how I would answer that. I am in full favor of ensuring that law enforcement across the country have the appropriate tools to handle enforcing the laws of our nation. That's really what the people want. The idea of defunding police makes absolutely no sense to me. I've been incredulous watching it. At the same time, I have made the point, and hopefully I represented it appropriately, that I do believe in a perfect world. When I went into the White House, and I'm no, wilting flower, right? I came from special operations, but I really wanted to focus more on countering radicalization and some of those softer skills. In a perfect world, we would focus on counter radicalization on all sides of the spectrum. If anyone has an interest in committing political violence, we're able to intervene early, because a lot of this is kids online, right? Using social media. The inflammatory rhetoric, what you're talking about from political parties, that's legal. And that is the problem with, again, for lack of a better term, of domestic terrorism. The problem is it is not against the law to make inflammatory comments. It is not against the law to be a racist. And First Amendment rights have always given some pause and a great deal of challenge to federal law enforcement. When is it freedom of speech? When does it cross over the line to become somebody that's mobilizing for violence? So that will continue to be a challenge for law enforcement. To summarize, I absolutely am in favor of ensuring that police across the country have the tools that they need. I think defunding police is absolutely a ridiculous idea. That said, reapportioning some resources, and I'm not hedging here, reapportioning some resources to make sure every policeman does not have to be a social worker or a psychologist and do things that are well beyond the scope. We ask an awful lot of our law enforcement. And again, I come from a very law enforcement centric background many, many years ago. So I appreciate the challenges that they're dealing with. I want to come back to one other point. Also, when I said heavy-handed operations overseas, I didn't make the point that we make a lot of enemies. It would be nice to more localize, as I said, counterterrorism problems overseas. And similarly, that goes for how we police. We have to ensure that we don't become overwhelming with police force. It needs to be appropriate. And I'm not saying it the way it's late in the day. What I mean to say is we shouldn't be heavy-handed in a counterterrorism front, and we shouldn't be overly militarized in a policing front. We need to find some balance. We need to ensure that it's smart policing. I know some state troopers in Massachusetts that put together a program to get into the community. And this isn't a soft program. They're in the community walking children to the school buses, but they're also, because they're former special forces non-commissioned officers in the National Guard and non-commissioned officers, right? They understand that it's about ensuring that organized gangs and criminal groups and cliques do not have legitimacy in the community. And they're able to do that by very direct law enforcement, but also walking kids to the school bus. It's not community policing solely, it's community policing plus hard knocks and arrests and prosecutions. But it's this balance of ensuring that policing is smart. And I hope those ideas proliferate across the country. It's called C3 policing. That's an example of what I think is smart policing. So that's a long-winded way of answering your question on a long day, but hopefully I did adequately.
Thank you. Chris, I know I said there was only one more question, and Miriam has made a request that if we could kind of help out with one more question yet, because we have a long-standing member and he's been very patiently waiting. So we want to give him the respect. Would that be okay?
Yep, absolutely.
And then I promise you no other questions after that. Miriam?
No, if there's somebody else that has a burning question, I can.
Thank you.
So yeah, and we see that most of our attendees are still present. So
yes.
Everybody is waiting and listening here.
And I request the last question to be framed as one question, not many questions put together. as one. Thank
yes,
you.
Gail, you know the protocol.
Gail.
Gail Murphy.
I think, Gail, you may be on mute.
You may have to, I gave you permission, but you may have to unmute yourself.
Okay, that's fine. We have reached the end of our time. And thank you everyone for your participation, and Mr. Costa, thank you. Thank you very much for your fascinating presentation and for taking the time to answer our questions. We appreciate you being here with us this evening. In closing, I would like to encourage you all to join us again for our next webinar on December 15th. We have Dr. Angela Stent, professor at Georgetown University and senior fellow at Brookings. She will present on her book, Putin's World, Russia Against the West and With the Rest. You can subscribe on our website to receive future event invitations. But for now, thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Mr. Costa. And everyone, have a great evening.
Thank you, everyone.
Miriam, thank you once again.
Thanks, guys.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Costa.
Thank you, Mr. Costa.
Very informative. Thanks, everyone, and we'll hope we'll see you again in December.